Hey everybody, welcome back to Warzone Eternal and some more coverage here for you. We wanted to tie on to the previous video where we were looking at the actual missions, but in general here is also part of the game setup chapter, and this is actually the previous step, but looking at the different deployment zones that the game offers us. A lot of games will have somewhat similar deployment zones for all the different missions they have, although Warzone does a couple of different things here as well. So a couple ways you can do that. If you're just playing a one-off, certainly you can roll a d20, figure out what you get. Same thing for the missions. In an event, they might already be predetermined for you, but basically this will give you both sides, and because it's so important for a lot of the missions, also the center line for that particular map type. So let's jump right over real quick. So this isn't going to be a super long video or anything, but just to show you what we get. So we start off with standard deployment, which is by all accounts here standard, right? It's pretty typical. You line up on one side, I line up on the other, starting at the board edges, and here this lets us go 8 inches in, which then gives us a pretty solid no man's land section in the middle with the center line smack dab obviously in the center. So if you're just looking to get a quick game setup, this is obviously going to be the go-to, right? Hey, let's just choose this and then we'll roll for sides and all that other stuff, along with whatever the mission's going to be. The other one is advanced deployment, not because it's necessarily more complicated or advanced, but because we're actually advancing further out. So there's going to be, essentially we're starting 6 inches in on each side just to get to the action a little bit faster, and they're 6 inches behind, or 6 inches away from the table edge. So it makes it a smaller no man's land, and again, the conflict or the battle is going to get started much sooner. So some things to think of there, obviously depending on your mission that's going to be chosen and what is required there, but also the forces you've brought versus the enemy. Some things to consider there, obviously closer ranges, a lot of things are more likely to be in more effective ranges much faster, and close combat's going to be an issue probably sooner rather than later. So another one that's not much more complicated than the standard. We're just essentially starting a little bit closer. But then we get into some others that are a little more advanced in what we got going on. The corner deployment one, so we got to measure that out. Basically, we're going 18 from each corner and then drawing a straight line across that. Same thing for the opponent. This one does present a pretty massive overall no man's land section here, so this will be an interesting one with a lot of these missions too, just because in some cases they're going to ask us to move up the battlefield and across it. So here we're kind of starting actually the furthest back in a certain regard as well, but and also just overall a smaller deployment zone, so it's going to bunch us up a little bit more tightly. Same thing for the opponent though, but so here, well, this would be one where if you have mobility or access to mobility in some of your troops, that'll be a good one to essentially get them to start spreading out and taking advantageous positions on the battlefield. So then finally, probably the most complicated of the four, and we do only get these four, barring one-off scenarios, customs, and other stuff for special tournaments, but flank deployment. So you've got essentially divided down the middle here, so you got the opponent's half and your half, except you don't control sort of a strip of deployment all the way across the table. You have essentially, you're going to measure 8 inches out from the corner and then kind of draw like a circle from that, and that's going to be your deployment. But you do have 2 deployment zones, so there, depending on mission 2 and what is required, that's going to give us some interesting options as far as maybe overloading one side, seeing if the opponent is maybe a little bit weak in one area, trying to maybe force that side and try and take control early, or just kind of doing a balanced deployment depending on the mission. There's just a lot of things that can go into that, but your force and your selection and gear and all that will also play a huge role in that. So that is the 4 deployment areas in a nutshell, guys. Pretty simple stuff, but again, we do get 4 of these in the 4 missions, or actually the multiple missions that we looked at. So the 4 missions here. So between the 2, we do have a pretty good selection of variables as far as we really shouldn't run into the same exact setup multiple times, right? You got the zones, the missions, and then obviously your force and the opponent's force. So there should be plenty of variables there to keep things fresh. Let us know what you think of these deployment zones and any memorable combos you've had so far with the deployment zone and the mission, and just the specifics of your individual game thus far in Warzone Eternal. Thanks for watching. We'll be back for more.